Vincent Holloway stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his downtown office, 43 years old and aware that every achievement in his life had required him to prove himself twice as hard as anyone else in the room. He had built Holloway Capital from nothing, a private equity firm that now managed over $800 million in assets, specializing in hospitality and commercial real estate. The view from the 42nd floor still amazed him sometimes, not because of the height but because of how far he had climbed from a childhood in South Memphis where his mother worked double shifts at a hospital just to keep the lights on. He remembered the first business meeting where a potential investor had mistaken him for the valet, the first property showing where the realtor assumed he was there to see the service entrance, the first 100 times someone looked surprised when he introduced himself as the principal. Those moments had shaped him, hardened him, taught him that success was not shelter from presumption but rather a spotlight that made the presumptions more absurd. 5 years ago, Vincent had purchased a historic building in the Arts District and transformed it into Meridian, an upscale new American restaurant that quickly became the city's premier dining destination. It was more than a business investment for him. He had envisioned a space that celebrated excellence without exclusion, where the carefully curated wine list and perfectly executed plates would be accessible to anyone who appreciated fine dining, where the staff would treat every guest with equal dignity regardless of how they looked or where they came from. He had hired a talented young chef named Alexis Chin who shared his vision, installed a general manager named Douglas Whitmore who came with impeccable credentials from 3 Michelin-starred establishments in New York, and then deliberately stepped back. Vincent believed in empowering his operators, in being a silent partner who provided resources and vision but let talented people do their work. He visited Meridian perhaps once a month, usually for carefully scheduled dinners where Douglas would walk him through new menu items and operational updates. The staff knew him primarily through the framed photograph in the back office, the owner who signed their paychecks but rarely appeared on the floor. This particular Tuesday afternoon, Vincent decided on an impulse to stop by Meridian for an early dinner. He had spent the day in casual meetings, wearing dark jeans, a simple gray Henley, and his favorite worn leather jacket, the kind of outfit he preferred when he was not performing the costume of corporate success. He had no reservation and had not called ahead, wanting to experience the restaurant as an ordinary guest would, to see the operation through fresh eyes without the performance that inevitably happened when ownership was present. As he pushed through the heavy glass doors at 5:30, the dining room was beginning to fill with the early evening crowd, professionals finishing late meetings over wine, couples celebrating quiet occasions at corner tables. The space looked exactly as he had imagined it during those long renovation meetings, all warm wood and soft lighting, exposed brick walls holding contemporary art from local galleries, the open kitchen visible behind a glass partition where line cooks moved with practiced precision. This was his vision made real, and for a moment he felt only pride. The hostess station stood just inside the entrance, a sleek wooden podium where a young woman named Charlotte was reviewing the reservation book. She glanced up as Vincent approached, and something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression, a tightening around her eyes, a fractional step backward. He had learned to read these micromovements over a lifetime, the subtle recalibrations that happened when white people encountered black bodies in spaces they considered exclusively theirs. Charlotte smiled, but it was the professional smile of someone performing customer service while managing an internal discomfort, and she asked if he had a reservation with a tone that suggested she doubted it. Vincent said he did not but hoped they might have space at the bar, and Charlotte's smile tightened further as she said she would need to check with the manager about walk-in availability, which was unusual because he could see at least 4 empty tables from where he stood and the bar was half empty. She asked him to wait one moment, her voice carrying the kind of exaggerated politeness that often preceded exclusion, and disappeared into the dining room, leaving Vincent standing alone at the entrance of his own restaurant. Vincent watched Charlotte weave through the tables toward the kitchen, and while he waited, a couple in their 60s arrived behind him, the man in khakis and a polo shirt, the woman in casual slacks and a cardigan, dressed no more formally than Vincent himself. Another host appeared immediately to greet them, all warmth and welcome, never questioning their reservation status, simply asking for a name and leading them directly to a window table with a view of the Arts District street scene below. The contrast was not subtle. Vincent had experienced this particular flavor of discrimination countless times, the way rules became flexible or rigid depending on who was seeking entry, the way dress codes were enforced selectively, the way benefit of the doubt extended infinitely in some directions and evaporated completely in others. He kept his expression neutral, breathing slowly, reminding himself that anger would only confirm whatever assumptions were already being made about him. Charlotte returned with Douglas Whitmore trailing behind her, and Vincent recognized his general manager immediately even though they had not seen each other in nearly 6 weeks. Douglas was in his early 50s, silver-haired and sharp-featured, wearing the expensive suit and restrained tie that suggested authority and refined taste. He had come from Daniel in New York, had worked under some of the industry's most respected names, and Vincent had been thrilled to bring that level of expertise to Meridian. Now Douglas approached with an expression that Vincent could only describe as preemptively defensive, the look of someone preparing to deliver bad news they believed was justified. Douglas greeted him with stiff formality and said that unfortunately they were fully committed for the evening, which was simply untrue given the visible empty tables, and when Vincent politely pushed back, suggesting he would be happy to wait at the bar for a seat to open up, Douglas's tone shifted into something more pointed. He mentioned that Meridian maintained certain standards for their dining room, that while they did not enforce a strict dress code, they did expect guests to respect the elevated nature of the establishment, and his eyes moved deliberately over Vincent's casual clothes as he spoke, making clear that Vincent's jeans and leather jacket were the problem being politely not named. Vincent felt the familiar weight settling into his chest, the exhaustion that came from being required to prove his humanity in spaces that should have simply welcomed it. He had a sudden sharp memory of being 17, trying to enter a department store in the upscale part of town, security following him through the aisles until he simply left, the assumption of criminality so thick he could barely breathe through it. He had thought success would change this, had believed foolishly that wealth and achievement would grant him the presumption of belonging, but here he stood in a restaurant he owned, being told essentially that he looked wrong, that his blackness combined with casual dress equaled someone who did not deserve a table. Douglas continued talking, something about protecting the experience for their regular guests, maintaining the atmosphere that had made Meridian successful, and Vincent understood that in Douglas's mind he was doing his job well, protecting the restaurant from the wrong element, never imaging that the wrong element in this case was the man who signed his paychecks. Other diners were beginning to notice the conversation at the hostess stand, heads turning with the curiosity that conflict always generated in public spaces. Vincent saw a woman at a nearby table whisper something to her companion, saw a man at the bar watching over the rim of his wine glass, and he recognized in their expressions a range of reactions from discomfort to agreement, some people clearly bothered by what they were witnessing while others seemed to approve of Douglas's gatekeeping, as if Vincent's presence genuinely threatened their dining experience. He considered revealing himself right then, simply stating that he owned Meridian and watching Douglas's face collapse into horror, but something stopped him. He wanted to see how far this would go, wanted to understand what his careful hiring and stated values actually meant when tested against the automatic racism that Douglas apparently carried in his assessment of who belonged where. It was a painful experiment to conduct on himself, but Vincent had learned that the only way to address institutional problems was first to expose them completely, to let them play out in full view so there could be no denial later about what had happened. Douglas was calling over one of the floor supervisors now, a younger man named Brett who approached with the wary expression of someone being asked to handle an unpleasant situation. Douglas spoke quietly to Brett but loud enough for Vincent to hear, asking him to politely but firmly help this gentleman understand that they could not accommodate him this evening, the word gentleman delivered with just enough emphasis to make clear it was a courtesy title being extended despite doubts about whether it was deserved. Brett looked uncomfortable but nodded, and Vincent understood that he was about to be physically escorted out, that this humiliation was about to escalate from subtle rejection to explicit removal. He stood very still, keeping his hands visible, making no sudden movements, because he knew that black men in moments of conflict had to manage not just their own actions but the fears and assumptions projected onto their bodies. Brett stepped closer and said in a low voice that it would be best if Vincent left voluntarily, that they did not want to create a scene, the implicit threat of police or greater force hanging unspoken in the air between them. Vincent looked at Brett's face, young and uncertain, clearly not comfortable with what he was being asked to do but also not willing to question the authority of his manager, and Vincent felt a wave of weariness so profound it nearly staggered him. This was not the first time, not the 10th time, not even the 100th time he had been presumed to be a threat or an intruder in spaces where he had every right to exist. He thought about his mother, how she had taught him to carry two identities, the private self and the public performance required to move safely through a world that saw his skin before his humanity. He thought about the years of building Holloway Capital, the way he had learned to code switch effortlessly, to make white investors comfortable, to laugh at jokes that were not funny, to work twice as hard for half the recognition. He thought about buying Meridian specifically because he wanted to create something different, a space that embodied excellence without exclusion, and here he stood learning that his own establishment had failed that mission entirely. There was a memory rising in him unbidden, from 20 years earlier when he was still in graduate school studying finance at Northwestern. He had gone to a networking event at an upscale steakhouse in Chicago, dressed in his only suit, arriving early and waiting near the bar for his professors and the finance professionals who were supposed to meet them. The restaurant manager had approached him and asked if he was there for the kitchen staff entrance, assuming automatically that a young black man in a suit must be restaurant labor rather than a graduate student at one of the country's top business programs. Vincent had corrected him politely, had shown his invitation, had watched the manager's face shift through confusion and minimal apology, and then had spent the entire evening with that moment lodged in his chest like a stone, unable to fully engage with the networking opportunities because part of his mind was still standing at that bar being told he looked like kitchen help. He had promised himself that night that when he had resources and power, he would create spaces where that kind of assumption could not flourish, where systems would prevent individual prejudice from becoming institutional practice. Now he understood how naive that promise had been, how insufficient good intentions were against the deep programming of racist presumption. He had hired Douglas based on credentials and references, had trusted that a professional with decades of high-end hospitality experience would bring not just operational excellence but also the human decency to treat all guests with equal respect. Instead, Douglas had apparently created or maintained a culture where black bodies in casual dress were automatically suspicious, where the assumption of criminality or inappropriateness happened before any actual assessment of behavior or intent. Vincent wondered how many other people had been turned away from Meridian for reasons they could not articulate but felt in their bones, how many potential guests had been subjected to this same elevated scrutiny, how many black families or couples or individuals had been made to feel unwelcome in a restaurant that was supposed to welcome everyone who loved good food and wine. Brett was still waiting for Vincent to leave, and Douglas had stepped back slightly as if distancing himself from the enforcement of his own orders. Vincent could see other staff members watching now from various positions in the dining room, servers hovering near their stations. The sommelier paused mid-conversation with a guest at table 12. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see how this conflict would resolve, whether Vincent would acquiesce quietly or create the scene that Brett had warned against. Vincent had learned long ago that black anger in white spaces became justification for whatever treatment had provoked it, that any display of emotion would be interpreted as proof that he was indeed the problem Douglas had identified. So he kept his voice level and said simply that he would leave, that there was no need for physical force, that he understood he was not welcome here. Douglas looked almost relieved, and Charlotte turned away quickly as if embarrassed by the entire interaction, and Brett gestured toward the door with something that might have been apologetic in his expression. Vincent walked back through the entrance he had come through 10 minutes earlier, moving slowly and deliberately, refusing to hurry or slink away as if he had done something wrong. He pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped onto the sidewalk, the early evening air cool against his face, and stood there for a moment looking back through the windows at the restaurant he had built. The irony was so bitter he could taste it, metallic and harsh on his tongue. He had been expelled from his own establishment, judged unworthy of eating food prepared in his own kitchen, served by staff whose salaries he paid, at tables he had personally selected during the renovation. If the situation were not so painful, it would have been absurd, a dark comedy about the persistence of racism even in spaces explicitly created to combat it. But there was nothing funny about the stone weight in his chest or the exhaustion that made his limbs feel heavy, nothing amusing about being 43 years old and wildly successful and still vulnerable to this particular species of humiliation. He stood on the sidewalk considering his options, and anger began to mix with the weariness, not the hot explosive anger that accomplishes nothing but a colder calculation about accountability and change. Vincent had not built an $800 million firm by accepting injustice passively, and he would not accept it now even when the injustice came from people he had hired and empowered. This moment revealed a systemic failure that required a systemic response, and Vincent knew exactly what that response needed to be. If you have been watching this story unfold and feeling the weight of these casual cruelties, the presumptions that happen every day in upscale restaurants and retail stores and office buildings, then you understand why these stories matter, why bearing witness to injustice is the first step toward demanding something better, and if you want to see more stories that refuse to look away from uncomfortable truths about race and class and power, then make sure you are subscribed to this channel, because we are going to follow this through to the end. Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, the device suddenly feeling heavier than it should, weighted with all the power and access it represented, and he scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Vincent pressed call and lifted the phone to his ear, his other hand braced against the brick wall of his own building as if needing physical support for what was about to happen. The line rang twice before a woman's voice answered with professional crispness, his chief financial officer Diane Reeves, who managed all operational aspects of Holloway Capital's hospitality portfolio. Vincent said her name and then without preamble explained where he was standing and what had just happened, his voice steady despite the adrenaline making his heart pound against his ribs. He described the rejection at the hostess stand, Douglas Whitmore's assessment of his appearance, Brett's polite threat of physical removal, the entire humiliating sequence delivered in clear simple sentences that left no room for misinterpretation. Diane was silent for a beat, and then her voice came back sharp with controlled fury, asking him to repeat what Douglas had said, making sure she understood correctly that Vincent had been expelled from Meridian for looking, in her precise words, too black and too casual to deserve a table. Vincent confirmed it, and Diane immediately shifted into operational mode, saying she would make calls, that she would have corporate counsel reach out to Douglas directly, that this required immediate response at the highest level. But Vincent stopped her, saying he wanted to handle this personally, that he would return to the restaurant in 10 minutes with her and whoever else she could mobilize quickly, and that the response needed to happen face to face because this was not just about one incident but about the culture that had allowed it to happen. Diane understood immediately, asking his exact location and promising she would be there in 8 minutes with Martin Chin, their corporate counsel, and probably several other members of the executive team who were still in the office. Vincent ended the call and checked the time on his phone, the digital display reading 6:03, and he committed to memory that in 10 minutes the entire reality inside Meridian would transform, that Douglas Whitmore's comfortable assumptions about who he was protecting the restaurant from were about to shatter completely. He remained outside on the sidewalk, not walking away because this was his property and his business and he had every right to stand exactly where he was standing. Through the large windows he could see the dining room continuing its evening service, servers delivering plates with practiced choreography, Douglas moving through the space checking on tables with the attentive presence of a manager who believed he was doing excellent work. Vincent wondered what Douglas would say later, how he would explain his actions, what justifications he would offer for the assumptions he had made. Would Douglas claim he was just following policy, protecting standards, maintaining the atmosphere that guests expected? Would he recognize that the real threat to Meridian's reputation was not a black man in jeans but a manager who could not see past his own prejudice to recognize that excellence and casual dress were not mutually exclusive, that respectability politics were just racism in a suit? Other guests were arriving now, a steady stream of well-dressed professionals and couples celebrating occasions, all of them being greeted warmly and seated without question about their reservation status or their appearance. Vincent watched a young man in ripped jeans and a designer t-shirt walk in with a woman in an elegant dress, and Charlotte immediately smiled and checked them in, no concern about the man's casual attire because his whiteness made his presence acceptable in ways that Vincent's blackness had not. The double standard was blatant, the kind of obvious discrimination that people love to pretend no longer existed in modern America, as if the election of black officials or the presence of black celebrities somehow erased the daily grinding reality of presumption and exclusion that most black people navigated constantly. Vincent thought about his staff, the kitchen team that was probably 40% people of color, the bussers and dishwashers who did the invisible labor that made elegant dining possible, and he wondered how they were treated by Douglas, whether the racism that had been directed at Vincent was something they experienced every shift or whether his successful appearance had triggered something specific in Douglas's gatekeeping instincts. A black Mercedes pulled up to the curb and Diane emerged from the back seat, followed by Martin Chin and 2 other executives Vincent recognized from his leadership team. Diane was in her late 40s, black herself and formidable in her tailored suit, her expression communicating barely restrained fury. Martin was younger, brilliant and sharp-edged, already pulling out his tablet as if preparing to document everything that was about to happen. They gathered on the sidewalk around Vincent, and Diane looked at him carefully, checking his face for signs of damage beyond the emotional harm that she already understood had occurred. She asked if he was all right, and Vincent appreciated that she did not minimize what had happened by suggesting it was no big deal or that he should let it go, but instead acknowledged the harm directly while moving immediately toward addressing it. He told her he was functional, that he wanted to go back inside with the team, that Douglas needed to understand who he had expelled and why that mattered beyond just the obvious irony. Martin asked if Vincent wanted him to lead the conversation, offering to be the anger that Vincent could not safely display as a black man in this situation. But Vincent shook his head and said this needed to come from him, that Douglas needed to hear directly from the person he had judged and rejected why those judgments were unacceptable. Diane nodded approval, saying she would be right behind him and that Martin and the others were there to witness and document, that this would be handled correctly with full corporate authority backing every word Vincent said. They moved together toward the entrance, a small group of executives approaching a restaurant that four of them partially owned through the Holloway Capital portfolio, and Vincent pushed through the glass doors for the second time that evening, this time not alone and not vulnerable to the assumptions of the staff inside. Charlotte saw them first, and her expression shifted immediately from polite hospitality to confusion and then concern, seeing Vincent return accompanied by people who clearly represented serious corporate authority. She started to say something about how they had already discussed his lack of reservation, but Diane cut her off with a voice that could freeze nitrogen and said that they needed to speak with Douglas Whitmore immediately, that this was a corporate matter requiring the general manager's immediate attention. Douglas appeared from the kitchen within seconds, alerted by Charlotte's suddenly panicked whisper into the headset she wore, and he approached with the confident stride of someone still believing he was in control of his restaurant and his decisions. He recognized Vincent first and his face hardened slightly, perhaps thinking this was some kind of escalation of the earlier conflict, that Vincent had returned with friends to make the scene he had avoided before, but then he saw Diane and Martin and the others, and something uncertain entered his expression. Diane introduced herself using her full title, Chief Financial Officer of Holloway Capital, the firm that owned this restaurant along with 17 other hospitality properties across 4 states, and she watched Douglas's face as the information landed. Martin added that he was corporate counsel, and the other executives identified themselves with titles that made clear this was not a random group of Vincent's friends but the actual leadership structure of the company that Douglas worked for, the people who ultimately determined his employment and his future in this industry. Douglas was intelligent enough to recognize immediately that something catastrophic was happening, that whatever assumptions he had made had been terribly wrong, but he had not yet made the full connection to Vincent, had not yet understood that the man he had expelled was not just some random guest but someone with direct authority over his career. Vincent stepped forward and said quietly that he wanted to know why Douglas had decided he did not belong in Meridian, why his appearance had been judged inadequate for a restaurant that did not actually enforce the dress code Douglas had cited. Douglas began to speak words about maintaining standards and protecting the dining experience, but his voice was uncertain now, defensive, and Vincent interrupted him and asked directly whether Douglas had ever turned away a white guest dressed as casually as Vincent was dressed. The question hung in the air, unanswerable honestly because they both knew the truth. Douglas stammered something about how it was different, how context mattered, and Vincent felt the rage that he had been carefully controlling begin to push against his composure. He said with precise diction that the only context that had mattered was his blackness, that Douglas had seen a black man in jeans and made assumptions about criminality or poverty or inappropriateness, that Vincent's race had marked him as someone who needed to be excluded from a space that existed specifically because he had envisioned it and funded it and believed it could be different. The recognition was dawning on Douglas's face now, color draining from his cheeks as he understood who he was talking to, as he processed that Vincent was not just connected to corporate leadership but was the ownership that corporate leadership reported to, that Vincent Holloway of Holloway Capital was standing in front of him explaining how he had been expelled from his own restaurant. Douglas said the name as a question, disbelief and horror mixing in his tone, and Vincent confirmed it with a nod, saying that yes, he was the owner, that he had come in for an early dinner without announcement because he wanted to see how Meridian operated when ownership was not expected, and that what he had discovered was that his own general manager had internalized exactly the kind of exclusionary racism that Vincent had created this restaurant to challenge. Douglas tried to speak, apologies tumbling over each other, explanations about how he did not know, how if he had recognized Vincent this never would have happened. But Vincent cut him off sharply and said that was precisely the problem, that Douglas's treatment of guests should not depend on whether they were the owner, that every person who walked through those doors deserved the same respect and dignity regardless of their race or their appearance. Other diners were fully aware now that something significant was happening at the front of the restaurant, conversation stopping as people turned to watch the confrontation unfolding at the hostess stand. Servers had frozen mid-service, uncertain whether to continue their work or wait for resolution of whatever crisis was occurring. Alexis Chin, the head chef, had emerged from the kitchen and was standing near the pass watching with wide eyes, clearly understanding that the evening had gone catastrophically wrong in some way she had not been part of but would be affected by. Vincent saw all of this, saw his restaurant holding its breath, and he made a decision about how to handle the next moments. He could destroy Douglas right here, could fire him publicly and make an example that would satisfy the anger burning in his chest, but that would solve nothing about the systemic problems this incident revealed. Instead, Vincent turned to Martin and asked him to document everything that had happened, to take statements from Charlotte and Brett and anyone else who had been involved in or witnessed the expulsion, and to prepare a full report for review by corporate leadership. Then Vincent looked back at Douglas and said that effective immediately he was suspended pending a full investigation into tonight's incident and his management practices more broadly, that they would be reviewing his treatment of all guests and staff to determine whether this was an isolated failure or indicative of deeper problems in how he ran Meridian. Douglas started to protest, to explain, to somehow salvage the career he could feel disintegrating, but Diane stepped forward and said in a voice that permitted no argument that he needed to collect his personal items and leave the property immediately, that he should not contact staff or attempt to influence the investigation in any way, and that he would be hearing from corporate HR within 24 hours about next steps. Douglas looked at Vincent one last time, perhaps hoping for mercy or understanding, but Vincent's face was impassive, and Douglas finally nodded and walked toward the back office to gather his things, his shoulders slumped in defeat. If you have stayed with this story through the anger and the sadness, through the all-too-familiar pattern of racism in spaces that claim to be beyond it, then you understand why this moment of accountability matters, why it is not enough to simply know that discrimination is wrong but essential to act when it happens, to demand consequences and systemic change rather than accepting polite apologies that cost nothing. And if you believe these stories serve a purpose beyond entertainment, if you think bearing witness to injustice and its consequences has value, then show that support by liking this video, by telling the algorithm that stories about real accountability deserve to be amplified and shared. Vincent turned to face the dining room, aware that every guest and staff member was watching him, waiting to understand what happened next and whether their evening would continue or dissolve into chaos. He took a breath and said in a voice loud enough to carry through the space that he apologized for the disruption to their dinner, that there had been a serious personnel issue that required immediate attention, but that service would continue and that Alexis and the team would take care of everyone for the remainder of the evening. Most diners seemed relieved by the permission to return to normal, turning back to their tables and their conversations, though he noticed several people watching him with new understanding, perhaps recognizing him now or simply aware that something significant about power and justice had just played out in front of them. Vincent asked Diane to stay and manage the evening service, to work with Alexis on ensuring that the kitchen and front of house could operate smoothly without Douglas, and Diane immediately agreed, already pulling out her phone to make calls to bring in additional management support. Then Vincent asked if the senior staff could gather briefly in the private dining room, and within 5 minutes he was standing in front of a group that included the sous chefs, the floor supervisors, the head bartender, the sommelier, and several servers who had been with Meridian since opening. They looked nervous, uncertain whether they were about to be fired or lectured or somehow blamed for Douglas's actions, and Vincent could see in their faces the fear that accompanies any moment when power structures shift suddenly and your position becomes precarious. He started by saying that what had happened tonight was unacceptable, that he had been refused service and expelled from the restaurant he owned because his general manager made racist assumptions about who belonged in Meridian based on his skin color and casual dress. Several staff members looked genuinely shocked, others looked down as if ashamed, and Vincent continued by saying that Douglas's actions did not happen in a vacuum, that culture came from the top but was maintained by everyone who participated in it or stayed silent when witnessing it. He asked directly whether any of them had noticed Douglas treating guests or staff differently based on race, whether there had been patterns of discrimination that had been normalized or ignored, and the silence that followed was damning in its length. Finally, one of the servers, a young black woman named Jasmine, spoke up and said that she had noticed Douglas was more likely to question reservations when the name sounded ethnic or when guests of color arrived, that he would hover near those tables as if watching for problems that never materialized. Another staff member, a Latino line cook named Carlos, added that Douglas had made comments in the kitchen about certain neighborhoods and certain types of customers that made assumptions about class and race, that it had been uncomfortable but Carlos had not known how to address it without risking his job. Vincent listened to each testimony, feeling his anger shift from focused rage at Douglas to a broader frustration with the systems that allowed this behavior to flourish, that made people choose between speaking up and staying employed, that normalized racist patterns until they became invisible to those not directly harmed by them. He thanked them for their honesty and said that Meridian was going to undergo significant changes starting immediately, that there would be mandatory anti-racism training for all staff, that hiring and promotion practices would be reviewed to ensure equity, that there would be clear channels for reporting discrimination without fear of retaliation, and that he would be personally more present going forward to ensure that the values he had intended for this restaurant were actually being lived rather than just stated in marketing materials. Vincent acknowledged that he bore responsibility too, that he had been too hands-off, had trusted too much in credentials and resumes without verifying whether his managers shared his commitment to genuine inclusion. He said that creating an equitable space required constant work and vigilance, that it was not enough to have good intentions, that systems needed to be built and accountability needed to be real and ongoing. One of the sous chefs asked what would happen to Douglas, and Vincent said honestly that he did not know yet, that the investigation would determine whether this was a pattern of behavior that required termination or whether there was genuine possibility for education and change, that he believed in second chances but not at the expense of people's safety and dignity. He said that his priority was ensuring Meridian became the kind of place where what happened tonight could not happen again, where every guest received equal treatment and where staff felt empowered to speak up when they witnessed discrimination. Alexis, who had been quiet throughout, finally spoke and said that she was ashamed she had not noticed what Douglas was doing, that she had been so focused on the kitchen and the food that she had not been paying attention to the culture in the dining room, and Vincent told her gently that this was not her failure, that racism often operated precisely by making itself invisible to those not directly targeted by it, but that now they all knew better and had a responsibility to do better. The meeting ended with Vincent asking them to return to their stations and finish service with professionalism and care, to treat every remaining guest that evening with the excellence Meridian was known for, and to understand that tonight marked a turning point for the restaurant. They filed out quietly and Vincent was left alone in the private dining room for a moment, sitting in one of the chairs he had selected during renovation, looking at walls he had chosen, feeling the full weight of what it meant to create something with purpose and then watch it fail that purpose through institutional neglect. He thought about all the people who had walked away from Meridian over the past 3 years feeling unwelcome, all the potential guests who had been subjected to Douglas's gatekeeping and never returned, all the harm that had been done in the name of maintaining standards that were really just coded language for excluding black and brown bodies from white spaces. Martin appeared in the doorway and said that they had statements from Charlotte, Brett, and 3 diners who had witnessed the expulsion, all of them confirming Vincent's account, all of them providing evidence that would make any legal defense impossible for Douglas to mount. Vincent thanked him and asked that everything be documented thoroughly, that this incident become part of Meridian's institutional memory rather than something swept away and forgotten. Martin promised it would be, and then asked Vincent directly if he was okay, moving past the professional relationship to the human concern underneath, and Vincent appreciated the question even though he had no simple answer. He was not okay, would not be okay for a while because this kind of harm accumulated rather than dissipating quickly, but he was functional and determined and clear about what needed to happen next, and sometimes that was enough. The investigation took 2 weeks and revealed that Douglas's behavior had been problematic in patterns that extended beyond the single incident with Vincent. Multiple staff members came forward with stories about how Douglas had treated employees of color, about microaggressions and biased scheduling and promotional decisions that favored white staff over equally qualified people of color. Several former guests reached out after news of the incident leaked, describing their own experiences of being made to feel unwelcome at Meridian, of being subjected to additional scrutiny or seated in less desirable locations or treated with suspicion that white guests did not experience. The documentation was extensive and damning, and Vincent made the decision to terminate Douglas's employment with a severance package that included mandatory participation in anti-racism education as a condition of receiving the full payout. Douglas accepted without fighting, perhaps recognizing that he had no position from which to argue, and Vincent never spoke with him directly again. Meridian underwent a complete cultural overhaul that Vincent personally supervised. He brought in consultants who specialized in anti-racism work in hospitality, experts who reviewed everything from hiring practices to table assignment policies to staff training protocols. Every employee participated in intensive workshops about implicit bias, about recognizing and interrupting racist patterns, about creating genuinely inclusive environments rather than spaces that simply claim to welcome everyone while maintaining subtle barriers. Vincent instituted a policy where he or another member of executive leadership would visit Meridian unannounced at least twice a month, sometimes dressed casually, sometimes in business attire, always observing how staff treated guests across the spectrum of race and class and appearance. He promoted Jasmine to floor supervisor, recognizing both her competence and her courage in speaking up, and he worked with Alexis to ensure that the values transformation extended into the kitchen and every aspect of operations. The incident had affected Vincent more deeply than he wanted to admit even to himself. He found himself returning to Meridian more frequently than was probably necessary, drawn by some need to reclaim the space, to prove to himself that it could be what he had intended. Sometimes he sat alone at the bar after hours, nursing bourbon and thinking about the distance between vision and reality, about how easily good intentions collapsed without structural support, about the exhausting reality of being a successful black man in America where even ownership did not guarantee belonging. His mother called one evening after hearing about what had happened through the extended family network, and she said something that stayed with him, that his pain was valid and that his success had not protected him because racism was never about individual achievement but about systemic power, that every generation had to fight these battles in new contexts, and that the work he was doing to transform Meridian mattered not just for his own healing but for everyone who would walk through those doors after him. Vincent decided to make the incident public, writing a detailed account that he published on Holloway Capital's website and shared across social media platforms. He described exactly what had happened, took responsibility for the failures and oversight that had allowed a discriminatory culture to develop, and outlined the comprehensive changes being implemented at Meridian and across all Holloway Capital hospitality properties. The response was overwhelming, thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories of being excluded from restaurants and hotels and clubs, of being made to feel that their presence was inherently problematic, of navigating the constant low-grade trauma of never knowing when the next humiliation would arrive. Many were grateful that someone with resources and platform was naming the problem publicly rather than handling it quietly behind closed doors, that Vincent was using his privilege to expose patterns that too often remained invisible to those not experiencing them directly. The story was picked up by local and then national media, journalists requesting interviews, business publications writing about discrimination in high-end hospitality, racial justice organizations citing Vincent's response as a model for corporate accountability. He did some of the interviews, carefully choosing which platforms would allow him to control the narrative and emphasize systemic change over individual villain stories. He talked about implicit bias and the ways that racism operated through assumptions and gatekeeping rather than always through explicit hatred, about how dress codes and behavior standards were often enforced selectively based on race, about the responsibility of business owners to build structures that prevented discrimination rather than simply hoping their employees would do the right thing. Some interviewers wanted him to express more anger, to perform the righteous rage they expected, but Vincent refused that script, maintaining instead a tone of determined purpose mixed with exhausted recognition that this fight was ongoing and probably endless. Meridian's business initially suffered, some regular customers uncomfortable with the scrutiny and change, but within months the restaurant was busier than ever with a notably more diverse clientele who appreciated both the quality of the food and the explicit commitment to equitable treatment. Reviews began mentioning not just Alexis's extraordinary cuisine but also the warm welcome extended to all guests regardless of appearance, the visible diversity among the staff, the sense that Meridian was genuinely trying to be different from other upscale establishments. Vincent hired a new general manager, a black woman named Patricia Simmons who had extensive experience in luxury hospitality and a proven track record of building inclusive cultures, and he worked closely with her during the transition to ensure that the changes implemented were sustainable rather than performative. The lawsuit threat never materialized because Vincent made clear from the beginning that he was not seeking to destroy Douglas personally but rather to address systemic failures, and Douglas's attorney advised him that fighting would only prolong the damage to his reputation while achieving nothing legally. Some people criticized Vincent for not being harsher, for offering severance and education rather than simply firing Douglas without support. But Vincent believed that accountability could include paths toward growth, that people could learn and change if given both consequences and resources, though he remained clear that Douglas would never work for a Holloway Capital property again. The mandatory anti-racism education became a condition not just for Douglas but for all management across Vincent's hospitality portfolio, a permanent institutional requirement rather than a one-time response to crisis. 6 months after the incident, Vincent sat at what had become his usual table at Meridian, a corner spot with good sight lines to both the entrance and the kitchen, and watched the evening service unfold with something approaching peace. He saw Patricia greeting guests with genuine warmth, saw the diverse staff working smoothly together, saw tables filled with people of all races and backgrounds enjoying Alexis's innovative menu. A young black couple came in for what was clearly a special occasion, dressed in their finest clothes, and Vincent watched the host seat them immediately at a prime table by the window, watched their server approach with respect and attentiveness, watched them relax into the experience of being welcomed without question. He thought about all the times he had not been welcomed, all the spaces where his presence had been treated as problematic, and he felt the familiar ache of knowing that this restaurant, this small victory, could not protect him or anyone else from the thousands of other establishments where racism still operated unchallenged. But it was something, this space where the culture had been rebuilt with intention, where mistakes had been confronted rather than hidden, where the work of equity was treated as ongoing rather than complete. Vincent finished his wine and signaled for the check, and when the server brought it she thanked him for what he had done, for speaking up, for making Meridian a place where she felt valued rather than just tolerated, and he told her honestly that she and the rest of the staff were doing the real work by choosing every day to treat people with dignity regardless of what assumptions might be easier. He left a generous tip and walked out through the same doors where he had been expelled 6 months earlier, and this time he walked out as someone who belonged because he had fought to make belonging real rather than theoretical. The phone call that had changed everything had taken 10 minutes to arrange and 30 seconds to make, but its effects would ripple forward indefinitely, shaping not just Meridian but Vincent's entire approach to business and ownership and responsibility. He understood now that being a silent partner was a luxury he could not afford, that his presence and vigilance were required to ensure his values actually shaped operations rather than just mission statements. He understood that racism was not something that could be solved once and forgotten but rather a constant pressure that required constant resistance, that every generation and every institution had to choose actively and repeatedly to interrupt patterns that would otherwise perpetuate themselves invisibly. He understood that his wealth and success were tools that could be wielded toward justice but were not themselves protection from the presumptions that shaped how black bodies were read in white spaces. Driving home that evening, Vincent thought about the message he wanted to leave for others who might face similar situations, who might be expelled from spaces they had every right to occupy, who might have to choose between accepting humiliation quietly or fighting back with whatever resources they could access. He thought about the countless people who did not have his wealth or platform or power to force accountability, who experienced this same discrimination but with no recourse, no ability to make that phone call that changed everything, no executive team to arrive as backup. Their stories mattered too, perhaps more than his, because they revealed the true scope of the problem, the way racism operated most freely when it faced no consequences. If you have watched this entire story unfold, if you have felt the anger and the exhaustion and the small triumph of accountability finally arriving, then you understand that these patterns are everywhere, that they persist because most people choose comfort over confrontation, because speaking up feels dangerous and remaining silent feels safe. And the question we all have to answer is what we will do when we witness these moments of casual cruelty and institutional racism, whether we will interrupt the pattern or allow it to continue, whether we will demand better from the spaces we occupy and the people we empower. So share your own experiences in the comments below. Tell us about times you witnessed presumptions based on race or appearance, about moments when someone's power was invisible until they chose to reveal it, about times when justice arrived or when it did not, because these conversations matter, because bearing witness together builds the collective will to demand that things change. Vincent pulled into his driveway, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment in the darkness of his garage, feeling the weight of the past 6 months settling into his bones. Tomorrow he would return to the office, would review quarterly reports and assess new investment opportunities, would continue building the empire he had constructed against considerable odds. But tonight he allowed himself to sit with the complexity of what it meant to be a black man with resources in America, to have power that was simultaneously real and limited, to fight battles that felt both urgent and endless, to create spaces of equity knowing they were islands in an ocean of ongoing discrimination. It was exhausting and necessary, painful and purposeful, and he would wake up tomorrow and continue the work because the alternative was accepting that things would never change, and Vincent had not come this far to accept anything less than the world he believed was possible, even if he had to build it one difficult conversation and one transformed institution at a time.